Good morning. It's Wednesday, May 28th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 600 days old. Hard to believe. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. Reports this morning of an Israeli strike on the Sana'a airport again. This is the main airport in the capital of Houthi-held territory. The Israeli strike is not hard to understand. The Houthis have continued to fire ballistic missiles at Israel at an alarming rate. It was only a matter of time before the Israelis struck back again. I don't like wars in general, but this theater makes me particularly uneasy. The Houthis have little to lose, and the Israeli operations require a heck of a lot of time and travel, which leaves lots of room for error. So far, all the Israeli reprisals have been successful and safe, so let's hope that continues. Today's guest is Scooter Libby. He's a distinguished fellow at FDD, and he once served as chief of staff to Vice President Dick Cheney, among other top government roles. We're going to talk to Scooter about what's really going on with aid distribution in Gaza and a bit more. That conversation's coming your way in just a few minutes. Is Israel seriously considering an attack on Iran's nuclear program? It sure seems like it. The New York Times is once again publishing leaks from unnamed sources claiming Israel may be on the brink of striking the Islamic Republic's nuclear assets. The logic is crystal clear. The Iranian air defenses are still down. The Islamic Republic can't fend off a strike. The proxies that would have ordinarily punished Israel for such an attack are weak. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria are all shadows of their pre-10/7 selves. So if there ever was a window for Israel, this would be it. The complicating factor here for Israel is Donald Trump and maybe Stephen Witkoff. The two men have been pursuing a nuclear agreement with the Islamic Republic. Never mind that we appear to be on the path to a revival of the flawed Obama nuclear deal of 2015. The two men insist that this is the right path as opposed to bombing. And it appears the Israelis may not agree, or at least they're not convinced. It's quite possible that all of this is a means to put additional pressure on the Iranian regime to relinquish its nuclear program. Yes, that would mean Israel is merely playing the bad cop. Then again, Israel may not be playing. This stuff is deadly serious, and this drama has been 15 years in the making. Leaks are not always real, but my sense is that the Israelis are truly tempted. Tensions are sky high in the Middle East. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Israel and Syria are holding direct talks. What a time to be alive. Sources tell Reuters that Israeli and Syrian officials have held security talks in recent weeks, including several face-to-face meetings along their shared border. A guy I never heard of named Ahmed al-Dalati is leading the charge for Damascus. He's the governor of Syria's Quneitra province, which borders the Golan Heights. As of earlier this week, al-Dalati is also in charge of security for Sueda province, which is where those bloody clashes between pro-government forces and Syria's Druze minority took place. It's unclear who's participating in talks on the Israeli side, but they're obviously part of Israel's security establishment. Before you get too excited, these talks are not about normalization. The focus is reducing tensions and maintaining security. Sources say these talks could pave the way for a political breakthrough. I did not have that on my bingo card. Headline 2, Germany is starting to change its tune as it relates to Israel. Yesterday, Germany's foreign minister threatened to act against Israel over the IDF's continued operations in Gaza. He didn't specify what actions Berlin might take, but indicated that a weapons embargo is possible. Berlin would not export weapons that are used to violate international law. That's the quote. And the implication here is that such a finding is possible. It's not just the foreign minister, though. At a press conference in Finland, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said that continued Israeli airstrikes in Gaza are, quote, no longer justified, end quote. I don't like where this is going. Germany has long held the line for Israel and Europe. That's actually a matter of German policy due to the country's Nazi legacy. This change in rhetoric might be a sign that it's time for Israel to wrap things up, but that can only happen on the right terms. A release of all the hostages, all of them, and a Hamas surrender in exchange for an end of the war. Headline 3, the Palestinian flag is about to fly at the World Health Organization, at the WHO. At their annual assembly, 95 countries voted in favor of allowing the Palestinian delegation to raise their flag at the headquarters. 27 countries abstained and 4 countries voted against the measure, including Israel and Germany. Remember what I said about Germany holding the line. The flag thing is symbolic. The Palestinians have observer status at the WHO, and that hasn't changed, but the flag is a sign of solidarity, and the vote could be a step toward broader recognition of a Palestinian state at the United Nations and beyond. This is a campaign that has long been in the works. The Palestinians have been pursuing this for more than a decade. The French, for one, are working hard to make all of this happen. They're lobbying the United Kingdom, Belgium, and the Netherlands to jointly recognize the so-called state of Palestine at an upcoming UN conference. We've written about this here at FDD, folks. The campaign's called Palestine 194. It actually started not in the Middle East, started in South America, of all places, and now it's spreading to Europe. Lovely. Okay, now it's time for my discussion with Scooter Libby, Chief of Staff to former Vice President Cheney, who was arguably the most powerful VP in American history, which would make Scooter maybe the most powerful Chief of Staff in American history at a Vice President's office. But we're not here to talk about history. We're here to talk about current events in the Middle East. So let's cut through noise and find out what's really going on with aid distribution in Gaza. Welcome to the program, Scooter Libby.
Thank you, John.
Well,
great to be here. It's my favorite and the most compact program of its kind. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for the kind words. All right, I want to start with you. You are a first-time guest on the program. You're obviously familiar with the show, which is great. And so I want to just ask you, tell us a little bit about your work in the U.S. government. I think most people know about the role that you played at the White House, but there was a bunch of other stuff before that, right?
So most of my career was as a practicing attorney in major law firms, but I did serve in the Reagan administration in the State Department for 4 years, and in the Defense Department under George H.W. Bush for 4 years, prior to the 5 years in the White House.
That's a lot of time.
I represented a congressional committee on China for a couple of years.
That's a lot of time in the U.S. government. That's time served, as we say. Okay, so all right, you have all this unbelievable experience. You've worked in various White Houses. You've done some important stuff on the Hill. So now, last year, you started something called the Gaza Futures Study Group. You're part of this new initiative. Tell us about it. It seems like it's probably more important now than it even was when you began.
So it actually began with a phone call from 2 businessmen in New York who had both been in government service. One was a Republican who had served in the George H.W. Bush administration in the Defense Department, Steve Price, and the other, Gary Ginsburg, had served in the Clinton White House. And they were concerned about, what do we do about the future for Gaza? There were plenty of efforts at that time to think about this, but they wanted to organize a group to put some time into it, and they called Elliot Abrams and me to set something up. So my first thought was to call John Hanna, a former FDD fellow and now at GINSA, and Rob Dineen, who had been Tony Blair's fellow at the on the Middle East, his top right-hand man, and Eric Edelman, another FDD person. And Elliot also brought in a former CIA analyst. So the notion was to use all of our contacts to gather information. And with the excellent help that GINSA provided, we conducted interviews in Israel and outside of Israel, probably over 100 interviews as a group, plus maybe a similar number of individual contacts or smaller group contacts to gather information during the fall of 2003. During that fall, we decided there were some bad proposals and some very bad proposals, and we hit upon a suggestion which we thought would make the most sense and presented it first to the State Department, and then with their permission to the Israeli government and other governments in the region.
Okay, so that led to this new initiative, which we're now watching in action. It's the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. It's up and running as of this week. Tell us about it. And it's, I think, the center of some controversy, which you wouldn't think would be so controversial here. If anything, you'd think that folks would be lauding this because it's something new and different, and it's giving the Gazan people an opportunity to access more food without having the sort of toxicity of UNRWA, and I think theoretically, at least, that it's going to circumvent some of the Hamas controls as well. So what's going on?
Right. So I'm not inside the actual efforts here that brought this thing to fruition. So I can't say what led to what. I can just say that we were early on in promoting this kind of idea. What the group does, the eventual form it has taken is a Swiss foundation, and it's dedicated to providing aid directly to the Gazans. And to understand the significance of that, I think we have to go back towards the origins of this war, which really didn't start in October 2023. It started maybe a decade earlier as Hamas began to divert massive amounts of aid into building an underground fortress, which would enable it to launch attacks. And as you know, it built 500 miles or so of tunnels underneath Gazan infrastructure, including civilian facilities like hospitals and schools, so that they could launch attacks against Israel and survive it for a long time. And that's the war that we're currently watching. It is the result of the diversion of aid. So the Gazan Foundation was basically conceived as a way to, or I should say, our notion of it in any case, was conceived because no matter how successful Israel was on the battlefield, there would still be thousands of armed PIJ or Hamas fighters floating around inside Gaza to disturb any attempt to unsettle their control of the population and drive them out. So there had to be a way to deliver aid to civilians behind whom they were hiding and who could be expected to hide. That's their style. And there had to be a way to deliver that aid morally to the civilians, but protecting it from being diverted, which is, if you had to say, what is the prime skill of Hamas? It's diversion of aid. That's been their funding. That's been their enabling factor for this war. So I would say I would list their skills as stealing aid, number one, diverting aid, number one, and number two is probably terrorist acts. So the group was designed to try and the group designed a solution which was designed to get at that, which was to have a delivery mechanism which would guard the food and deliver it directly to Palestinians. And that is what the Gaza Foundation is now trying to do. It's challenging, of course. Hamas can go to an individual family and then at gunpoint steal the food from them, but that would be very labor intensive, and it would also probably engender even more anger against Hamas than we have seen. So that's the notion behind it. It began delivering aid a couple of days ago. So far, it's delivered as of, well, I shouldn't say so far. As of yesterday, it had delivered, I think, over 500,000 meals to Gazans out of 3 or 4 operating sites. Maybe it's 2 or 4 at the moment. But they intend to expand to the point where they can deliver food to the entire population.
Yeah, and that's obviously the goal, but I think there's also another goal, which is to deprive Hamas of the ability to distribute that aid, because once that happens, then Hamas loses control of the Gaza Strip from an administrative perspective, right? And then it just becomes an armed group that's operating underground and not with a lot of weaponry, and most of the fighters at this point are not the skilled fighters. We're now talking about young men in tracksuits picking up AK-47s. So what you do is you reduce them even further to just a bunch of people who are fighting from underground locations. That appears to be Israel's objective here, and I think the foundation is going to probably help in that regard, and obviously make sure that people are fed, because that has been an important element of the discussion here. And I noted Germany's upset, the Brits are upset, the French, the Canadians. We're hearing a lot more about the need to distribute aid. So I think this is obviously crucial. But there's more happening in Gaza. I mean, when you look at this war, you were involved at the White House with a handful of other Middle East conflicts. What's your prognosis in Gaza? I mean, how do you look at this conflict right now?
Well, it's a hard conflict to predict. I think they will have to solve the civilian problem in order for the international community to be comfortable with progressing. And in that process, as you just pointed out, delivering food directly to civilians and giving them some breathing space without Hamas's foot on their throat, preventing food from getting down it. Without that type of freedom for the Gazans, there's very little chance of removing this terrorist group from the leadership of it, which means that eventually you're going to end with more death and more killing as long as Hamas can maintain its control.
Hmm.
So they have to find a way around that. That's what this foundation is
Hmm.
intending to do. And then I believe what they would hope is that local leadership will emerge organically in the way that was envisioned back before Oslo, that there would be leadership among Gazans who want to have a better life. And the key question for for analysis is, what are those proportions? Are there 15% of Gazans who are willing to live peacefully side by side, or as we would hope, 85% or 95%? And that will determine the future of Gaza.
Hmm. Yeah, and I don't know how to judge that. I was actually recently in a discussion with Khalil Shikaki, who's one of the pollsters, probably one of the better known pollsters in the territories. And I got to say, the numbers, I don't really know how to read them. I don't think that people are necessarily honest when they talk about how they feel about Hamas in the Gaza Strip. I think a lot of people are still afraid, and it's for that reason that they probably haven't stood up. But maybe if the group is further eroded, if it loses the ability to distribute aid while it's being defeated on the battlefield, maybe that changes the dynamic. We've got to hope. I got one more question for you, Scooter, and I want to ask you to zoom out. We're hearing a lot about the Israelis right now and a possible strike on that Iranian nuclear program. You were, I guess, just out of office the last time the Israelis struck a nuke site. That was the Al-Kibar reactor in Syria. So I guess my first question is, are you confident that the Israelis can do this? Because you clearly had conversations with the Israelis about what they were able to do back then, and they're probably only better at it now. And then I guess there's the broader question, which is, what happens if this actually goes through?
Well, I don't run an intelligence service or fly F-15s as frequently as you might think. But my sense is they can do a great deal of damage. That's certainly what they privately and publicly say. It certainly would be better if the Americans were involved, because we have certain capabilities that would make for more kinetic impact and ability to linger. If I were the Ayatollahs, I'd be very concerned about an Israeli strike. Both going back to Osirik, which was maybe a better analogy because it was a long range attack by the Israelis at a time when people thought they couldn't strike that far. Now the Israelis have shown it in recent times with taking out the air defenses. They refrained from taking out the oil the last time around, I think in part because of Biden administration attitudes, and in part to leave a stronger warning shot in front of the Iranians. But they can not only damage the nuclear infrastructure, but they can certainly do a lot of damage to other elements that the regime rely on, including the IRGC and the oil facilities that finance their terror. So, with a much more receptive audience in the Trump administration than they had with the Biden administration, I believe they could do a great deal of damage if they're forced to. If President Trump cannot get his desired dismantlement project, something which FDD has pushed very hard on along the way, I think we could have trouble. And the Ayatollahs could have a great deal of damage ahead of them.
All right, well, we're going to keep watching this one. But in the meantime, I want to thank you, Scooter Libby, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you, John.
All right, that's a lot going on here. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. A brand new episode of FDD's Foreign Policy is now out. Host Cliff May is joined by FDD's John Hardy and Mark Montgomery to unpack their latest research memo, which outlines a strategy for how the United States can apply significant economic pressure and compel Russia to agree to a Ukraine ceasefire. Highly recommend you give this one a listen. Wherever you get your podcasts, be sure to check out the memo on FDD's website as well. Don't miss my colleague Jonathan Sayah's piece in The National Interest on why the United States must remain unwavering in its demand for complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. Critics have warned that such a position could lead to war, but Jonathan argues that the greater danger lies in America deterring itself from standing firm against even a hint of continued Iranian nuclearization. And if you haven't had enough of me today, I did join the Commentary Magazine podcast with John Podhoretz. Last week, we discussed last week's horrific terror attack in Washington, D.C., and the Hamas-inspired rhetoric that helped set the stage for it. We also explored Trump's recent crackdown on Harvard and other universities, the shifts in policy in the Middle East, evolving dynamics in the region, and more. I always enjoy talking with those guys, even when the subject matter is difficult. So by all means, check that one out as well. That is going to do it for today, folks. If you want more super smart stuff to read, check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org, or take a scroll through our X, Instagram, and YouTube content. And while you're at it, please do support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Friday for another riveting episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.